It is my great honor this morning to introduce our speaker, Dr. Stephen Fahrig, who is an associate professor of biblical theology here at Kenrick-Glennon Seminary, and who is also a candidate for the permanent diaconate for the St. Louis Archdiocese. He grew up in Alton, Illinois, and holds a doctorate of sacred theology from Boston College. Dr. Fahrig and his wife, Nori, are parishioners of St. Joseph's in Clayton, where Nori serves as director of sacred music, and Steve is involved with adult faith formation. The title of his talk today is The Book of Ruth, Mirroring God's Faithful Love. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Fahrig.
I may have given you too many handouts as I realize as I'm trying to balance all of them up here. So I've given you a handout of the entire text of the book of Ruth. I don't know if any of you were adventurous and decided to read it prior to coming here today, but if not, that's perfectly okay, because the book of Ruth is a very short book of the Bible, so we're going to look at some of the text today, and you can read the rest on your own. Before we jump right into that, just a couple of introductory thoughts. Thank you for that very fine introduction. In the musical Fiddler on the Roof, the protagonist, Tevye, sings his famous song, "If I Were a Rich Man," in which he lists the things he would like to do if he were a man of greater financial means. Among them is his desire to spend hours each day studying the scriptures. He says, "I'd discuss the holy books with the learned men several hours every day, and that would be the sweetest thing of all." Well, I'm definitely not a rich man, but I count myself very blessed by God to have the privilege of devoting my life to studying the sacred scriptures and sharing the fruits of that study with others, with the men here at the seminary in formation for the priesthood, and with all of you here today as we come together to reflect on one of my favorite books of the Bible, the book of Ruth. Ruth is a very charming work. It's an easy-to-read book. You can sit down and really read it in one sitting. We would almost, but not quite, have time to do that today. And actually, I'm putting my phone here just so I can keep track of the time. I don't want to go over my allotted time with you today. The book of Ruth is charming, simple to read, and yet it contains a very complex and carefully crafted narrative. In our Christian Bibles, the book of Ruth is located after the book of Judges and before the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. The reason for placing Ruth between those particular books is to do with the setting of the story. We read in the opening verse that the book of Ruth takes place in the days when the judges ruled. Also, as the biblical scholar Ellen Davis points out in an excerpt from her commentary on the Old Testament, which I've included in your handout, when the little book of Ruth is read right after Judges, it is evident that the two fit together as complementary opposites. Ruth, she says, is the still, small voice after the cataclysmic storm of Judges. In the wake of Judges' scenes of large-scale violence, deeply problematic national leadership, and moral deterioration of the whole people of Israel, Ruth is a story of personal relationships that prove to be redemptive in the eyes of a few ordinary people, yet ultimately point in the direction of hope for Israel as a whole. In the Jewish Bible, which follows a different order than our Christian Old Testament, the book of Ruth comes after Proverbs. This is also an interesting and very appropriate placement Because if you know anything about the book of Proverbs, you will know that that book concludes with a famous poem extolling the virtues of a worthy woman. And Ruth is certainly a model of what it means to be a worthy and virtuous woman. Before we delve into the book, I want to just say a few things about where this book came from. We don't really know who wrote the book of Ruth. Some people suggest that it may have been written originally by a member of David's royal court. Others look to the book's sensitivity to women's issues and relationships and suggest, well, maybe the book of Ruth was written by a woman. We don't really know for sure, and that answer will remain a mystery to us this side of eternity, nor do we know exactly when the text was written. As I pointed out, the book is set during the period of the Judges, before Israel had a king. However, it was clearly written at a later time. The very words "in the time of the Judges" indicates a certain temporal distance between the writer of this story and the events that are being set forth. But the question is exactly how much distance? When exactly was the book of Ruth written? There's basically two opinions that scholars have put forth. Some believe that it was written during or very shortly after the reign of King David, as a means of defending the legitimacy of his kingship. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it was widely known that David had Moabite ancestry. Why is that a problem? Well, we're going to delve into that shortly when we look at the details in the book of Ruth, but I'll simply say the Moabites were a people who were not very well regarded in ancient Israel. In fact, they were something of an enemy of the people of Israel. And so it was a little bit problematic that the king would have an ethnic background that included Moabite blood. So to counteract any negative grumblings about David's ancestry, so the theory goes, a scribe in the royal court composed the book of Ruth as a means of highlighting the virtuous nature of David's Moabite great-grandmother, Ruth. Other scholars believe that Ruth was written many centuries later after the Jews returned from exile in Babylon. In the aftermath of the Babylonian exile, many Jews turned inward and really became somewhat xenophobic. They looked unfavorably on contact with outsiders to the point that marriage with non-Jews was, for a time, forbidden. Some biblical scholars think that the book of Ruth was composed as a response to this development. The aim of Ruth, in this way of thinking, was to show that Jews need not fear mingling with Gentiles, even to the point of marriage, because the great dynasty of King David never would have existed without Ruth, a Gentile, being part of David's family tree. Both of these arguments are very compelling, and one complicating factor is the issue of the language that Ruth was written in. Much of the story was written in classical Hebrew, the form of the language that was spoken and written prior to the Babylonian exile. As we all know, language develops and evolves over time. Compare Shakespearean English with the type of English that we contemporary Americans speak, and you get a sense of that evolution. Some might say devolution, but that's a matter of opinion. At any rate, much of Ruth is written in classical Hebrew, but there are some more contemporary Hebrew phrases, contemporary meaning after the Babylonian exile, as well as words coming from the Aramaic language, which the Jews would have spoken after returning from Babylon. I think the best way to explain the origins of the book of Ruth is one advocated by the biblical scholar Scott Hahn, which is to suggest that the book of Ruth went through two editions. It was originally written at the time of King David, and then after the Babylonian exile, a second edition with some touched-up language was issued. The purpose of the first edition was to defend David's claim to the throne, And the purpose of revising and updating it after the Babylonian exile was to bring the book once again into the public eye in light of these debates that were going on about Jews intermingling with Gentiles. So that's as much as we can probably say about the origins of the book. Now, the next question we would want to ask before jumping into the text is, what kind of biblical book is the book of Ruth? One absolutely essential principle for successfully and correctly interpreting any passage or book of the Bible is to correctly identify its literary genre. A lot of unnecessary difficulties in biblical interpretation can be quickly overcome if we're clear right from the outset when reading a book of the Bible, what type of literature is it that we are reading? A famous example of this would be the creation stories in the book of Genesis. Many fundamentalists read these as if they are literal scientific accounts of the creation of the world. Biblical scholars will say, no, we have to look at what type of literature this really is. And as any of us familiar with modern literary genres knows, we would read a biography much different than we would read a romance novel. We would read a book of poetry much differently than we would read a science textbook. Dei Verbum, one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council that dealt, among other things, with biblical interpretation, made this point very clear. I'll quote from it briefly. To search out the intention of the sacred writers, attention should be given, among other things, to literary forms. For truth is set forth and expressed differently in texts which are variously historical, prophetic, poetic, or of other forms of discourse. So when we come to the book of Ruth, one of the debates that goes on among biblical scholars is this a historical story or is this simply a work of fiction? Some scholars say, well, this is probably just a folk tale, maybe based on some information from King David's family tree, but not really containing any historical truth. Others, and I would side with these others see it as an edifying story about real people and real events. Certainly, the book of Ruth, as we have it in the Bible, is a very skillfully crafted literary composition. On the other hand, it seems to me very highly unlikely that if someone were simply going to write a fictionalized account of one of the ancestors of King David, it seems highly unlikely that the author would make that ancestor of David not only a Gentile, but a member of a people, the Moabites, for whom the Israelites had a great deal of contempt. So that alone leads me to believe that the book of Ruth is based on historical events, which the author tells in the form of a short story, a historical novel, if you will. And that basically is the literary genre. Now, some have jokingly referred to the book of Ruth as the ancient version of a chick flick, a romantic comedy. And there is actually some truth to this. There are certain elements in the book of Ruth that are very much like contemporary romantic comedies, including a matchmaking scheme in which Ruth's mother-in-law tries to get her married off to Boaz, her relative, and all of it seems like it's going to fall apart at the last climactic moment, but then, lo and behold, everything works out well. Ruth and Boaz get married and live happily ever after. Well, if you haven't read the book of Ruth, I just spoiled the ending for you, but I was going to do that anyway. So the book is really divided into two basic parts. In the first two chapters, we read about this young woman, Ruth, who makes a decision to leave her people and her family in order to live in Bethlehem in Judah. She attaches herself to the people of Israel. Basically, the story begins by telling how a Jew named Elimelech moved from the land of Judah during a time of famine and settled in the land of Moab with his wife and his sons. His sons, while there, marry Moabite daughters, but then very tragically, Elimelech and his 2 sons all die, leaving just the women. Ruth's fellow daughter-in-law, Orpah, who marries one of Elimelech's sons, decides to stay in Moab, but Ruth goes with Naomi, her mother-in-law, back to Judah. And when she goes back, she finds herself in a very precarious situation because Naomi and Ruth are without financial means. And so Ruth has to go basically glean for the scraps of agricultural produce in a field, and miraculously, the field is owned by a relative of Ruth's family. This leads into the second part of the story, in which Ruth formally becomes a member of the house of Israel by marrying Boaz, this relative. This structure is then very neatly subdivided into the 4 chapters of the book that is found in our modern Bibles. Chapter 1 deals with Ruth journeying with her mother-in-law Naomi from Moab back to Bethlehem in Judah. Chapter 2 deals with Ruth meeting her future husband Boaz in a field. Chapter 3 deals with Ruth soliciting a marriage proposal. Ruth was a very bold young woman. She basically sought Boaz's hand in marriage. And then finally, chapter 4 contains the climax of the story. Boaz claims his right to marry Ruth. If we were to stage this as a 4-act play, each of the chapters takes place in a different location. The first chapter in the land of Moab, the second chapter in a field in Bethlehem, the third chapter a threshing floor in Bethlehem, and finally the 4th chapter at a city gate in Bethlehem. The characters in the story all have very interesting names. All of the names are symbolically significant. The father of the family, whom we meet at the beginning of the story, is named Elimelech, which is a compound of 2 Hebrew words, El meaning God and Melech meaning king. Literally, his name means, my God is king. Naomi has a very ironic name. Her name means sweetness or pleasantness, and at least for the first half of the story, Naomi is anything but sweet or pleasant. Ruth, on the other hand, has a very appropriate name. Her name is based on the Hebrew Reuth, which means friend or companion. Orpah, who also marries one of Elimelech's sons, means back of the neck. This also is very symbolically important because when Orpah is given a choice to either go to Bethlehem with Naomi and Ruth or to stay behind in Moab, she chooses to stay behind. She turns around and walks away, hence back of the neck. By the way, here's a little bit of trivia for you. Oprah Winfrey, you may have heard of her. She was actually named for this biblical character. Her parents named her Orpah, but nobody could get Orpah right. Everybody started calling her Oprah, so she just ended up changing her name to Oprah. The 2 sons in the story, Mahlon and Chilion, their names are also symbolically significant. Mahlon means sickness, and Chilion means perishing. Another spoiler alert, things don't end up very well for them, as their names suggest. And then finally, Boaz, this name means strength or reliability. So what I want to do at this point, I'm not going to take us line by line through the whole book, but I think it would be interesting just to read the opening chapter. So if you'll bear with me while I do that, and then I'll offer some thoughts on it. The opening chapter sets the scene for the entire story. So we read, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was bereft of her 2 sons and her husband. So I'll just pause there and make a couple of notes. In the first verse, note the reference to the time of the judges. The judges were tribal leaders who were raised up by God to deliver Israel from oppression from their enemies. This was prior to the establishment of a monarchy in Israel. The time of the judges was a very tumultuous, chaotic time, and the book of Judges actually ends on an ominous note saying at that time there was no king in Israel and every man did as he pleased. There was a sense of moral and political lawlessness. Interestingly enough, the patriarch of this family that we meet in the book of Ruth, who lived at a time when there was no king in Israel, his name reflects who Israel's true king really is, God. Elimelech, my God is king. There's also a bit of irony in the location of this famine. We are told there is a famine in the land. Well, where is the land? Bethlehem in Judah. Bethlehem, the birthplace of King David, and of course, later the birthplace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, literally means house of bread. It's a compound of 2 Hebrew words, Beth meaning house and Lechem meaning bread. There was famine in the house of bread, ironic given the name of this town. So the family has to travel elsewhere. Interestingly enough, we are told that they go to the land of Moab. Now Moab, just to give a brief bit of background, I mentioned earlier the Moabites were enemies of Israel, and yet there was also a kinship between them. But the origins of the people of Moab were, shall we say, rather shady and questionable. On your handout, I have a slide with Moab and a little map indicating where it is. Moab is across the Jordan River. It's located in the territory of the modern kingdom of Jordan. And according to the book of Genesis, the nation of Moab originated from a rather dark and unpleasant moment. We know the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot and his daughters are the only ones to survive. And Lot's daughters make their father drunk and have relations with him, and they each bear children. And we read that the first daughter bore a son and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. So the Moabites were always looked down upon by the Israelites because of their questionable origins. And throughout the subsequent writings of the Old Testament, we find a lot of negative references to Moab. Judges chapter 3 tells the story of an Israelite assassin who kills Eglon, the king of Moab. That's a story that is quite interesting and even entertaining, and I'll save that for another time. But if you care to read Judges chapter 3, it's sort of an interesting story. But the point is, the Israelites had a lot of contempt for the Moabites, and yet the writer of Ruth does not make any kind of negative commentary. The writer simply notes that, well, they went to Moab, they settled there, and the sons married Moabite daughters. Let's look at a little bit more of the text. Then she, that is Naomi, started with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So they set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find a home, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say that I have hope, even should I have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So notice Orpah is going away, back of the neck, but Ruth clings to her mother-in-law. And then we read on, "And she said, 'See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law.' But Ruth said, 'Entreat me not to leave you or return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if even death parts me from you.' And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more." Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. Ruth here is demonstrating remarkable loyalty to her mother-in-law. Naomi is ironically, again, here's an interesting irony in her names. Naomi means sweetness or pleasantness. Naomi says that she is very bitter. This woman whose name connotes sweetness is very bitter about the hand that she's been dealt in life. And understandably so. She's lost her husband. She's lost her sons. She has no means of financial support. And to her, what Ruth is proposing to do, coming back with her to Bethlehem, seems insane. Go back to your own land, find a husband, take care of yourself. But Ruth refuses to do that. In verse 8, Naomi, when she's trying to persuade the 2 daughters-in-law to go home, she says, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead." Literally in Hebrew, this says, "May the Lord do chesed to you." Chesed, which I have on your handout, this is probably one of the most important words in the Old Testament. A literal translation of it would be loving kindness or steadfast love. Chesed is a term that is used in the Old Testament to describe God's absolute unconditional love for his people, the love that God continues to have for his people even when they are repeatedly unfaithful to him. Chesed is the sense that God will always love us, will always welcome us back, will always give his graces to us, even though we do nothing to deserve them. And human beings are called to model that in their interactions with one another. To do chesed, as Naomi says, means to demonstrate loyalty and love beyond what is required by the law and beyond anything that the recipient expects or deserves to receive. One of the beautiful lessons that we can take away from the book of Ruth is that Ruth, this ordinary Moabite woman, is a human image of the divine love. She is loyal to her mother-in-law, even though as we see at the end of the chapter, Naomi is rather indifferent. Ruth makes this beautiful profession of loyalty. I will go wherever you go. I will lodge where you lodge. Your God will be my God. And Naomi's basically just like, oh, okay, whatever. Do what pleases you. She's rather indifferent to this profound loyalty that Ruth is showing her, which should prompt us to think about the times in our lives when we've been graced and blessed by God and yet have not really been all that impressed, if you will, with what God has done for us. One other bit of biblical background I should mention here. When Naomi makes this strange statement about, well, I'm too old to get married and have children again, but even if I had children, they'd have to grow up before you can marry them. What is this referring to? There's a passage in Deuteronomy, and this is indicative of the Old Testament's concern, of God's concern for those who are poor and vulnerable. In the days of ancient Israel, there was no social security system. If you did not have a husband or children to provide for you, you were in an extremely vulnerable position. This is why widows and orphans are always singled out in the Old Testament as particularly vulnerable categories of persons because they did not have any means of support. There was a provision in Deuteronomy that if a man died leaving a widow and the man had an unmarried brother, the brother was obliged to marry the widow and produce an heir for her. This is actually behind the passage in Matthew's Gospel when the Sadducees mock Jesus about the resurrection. They tell this story about a woman who had 7 husbands and they all died one after the other. It's based in this practice that's set forth in Deuteronomy. What Naomi is saying is, I can't possibly at this stage in my life have any more children, and you'd have to wait until they grow up anyway, so just go back and find yourself a husband. So Ruth will not do that. She is faithful, and in the final verses of the chapter, we read the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And they came to Bethlehem, and the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And then in a very clever play on words, Naomi says, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Mara means bitterness in Hebrew. So she's saying, don't call me Naomi, don't call me sweetness, call me bitterness. It would be like a woman named Hope who is very depressed, and somebody says, "Oh, hello, Hope." And she says, "Don't call me Hope, call me despair." That's what Naomi is very sarcastically doing here. She's very angry at her lot in life. She goes on to say, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has afflicted me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Notice that the narrator keeps reminding us that Ruth is a foreigner, even when the context does not necessarily require this information. It's like the author saying, look, she's a Moabite. Do you get it? She's a Moabite. That's important to the story. So at this point, I just have to summarize the rest of the story. So in the second chapter, Ruth goes to gather up leftover grain in a field, and she finds out that the field is owned by a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. And this is the turning point of the story, because given those Deuteronomic rules about a relative marrying a deceased relative's widow, when Ruth discovers that Boaz is a relative, she goes back and she gives that information to Naomi. And this is where Naomi starts to come out of her dark depression. She realizes, wait a minute, maybe there is hope for us after all. What we have to do is we have to get the two of you together. And so here's where really the romantic comedy element of the story comes into play. In chapter 3, Naomi starts getting Ruth all dolled up to go meet Boaz in the evening time at the threshing floor. She says, wash and anoint yourself, put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. So they're hatching this scheme to get the two of them together, and then Ruth does exactly that. She casts off her widow's garb and she dresses all up to go meet this man. And later we are told that when he's sleeping, she's laying at his feet, and he wakes up in the night and says, "Who are you?" It's dark, he probably doesn't know who she is. And she says, "I am Ruth, your maidservant. Spread your skirt over your maidservant, for you are next of kin." This is essentially her asking for a marriage proposal. In the book of Ezekiel, we have this image of God as the bridegroom to Israel, which is his spouse. And God says, "I passed by you again and looked on you. You were at the age for love. I spread the edge of my cloak over you and covered your nakedness." This image of spreading a cloak over someone is a sign of betrothal. So Ruth rather boldly asks Boaz to marry her. And Boaz is willing to do so, but then in classic romantic comedy fashion, there's a catch. It turns out there's another relative who has a prior right, I guess because he's in a closer degree of kinship to Elimelech. He has a right to marry Ruth before Boaz does. And this is rather sad because Ruth has taken a shine to him. She wants this man to be her husband. So what's going to happen? That's the drama. And it all resolves itself in the final chapter because the other guy is kind of a deadbeat. He doesn't want to marry Ruth. He doesn't want to do his Levitical duty by marrying Ruth, because if he does that, any children she has, any property she has, will belong not to him but to Ruth and her children. So he passes on that, and Ruth is able to marry Boaz. And the book concludes with the notation that Boaz marries Ruth, becomes her husband, she becomes his wife, and then they have a child. And Naomi, at this point, realizes how blessed she is. She's been blessed with a new family, if you will. She has a grandchild. And then at the very conclusion, the writer of this text connects this simple story, seemingly just ordinary family in Israel with no great importance. We learn that, in fact, from this ordinary family will come one of the greatest figures in the Old Testament. The final 4 verses, or 5 verses, give us a little genealogy. These are the descendants of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Aminadab, Aminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, the male protagonist in our story, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. If you're familiar at Advent and Christmas time with the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, this is a portion of that genealogy. That's one of my other favorite passages, so hint, hint back there, if you want to invite me back in December to talk about the genealogy, that could be a fun topic. So there's so much more I could say, but I want to just conclude by talking about the theological message that emerges in this story. Among other things, the writer of Ruth is trying to show that preservation of one's religious identity is not incompatible with openness to other people and other nations. During the time of David the king, when questions might have been raised about David's Gentile ancestors, the story of Ruth would have served as an important reminder that goodness and virtue can be found everywhere, even among the hated Moabites. Later, after the Babylonian exile, when a wall of separation was being built up between Jews and Gentiles, the reviser of the book of Ruth is offering a positive portrayal of a mixed marriage between Boaz, an Israelite, and Ruth, a Moabite. One message that emerges here is that God's plan of salvation is not for Israel alone, but for all men and women of every nation. Israel's vocation was to be a light to the nations so that all people ultimately could be brought into the family of God. Another important issue that emerges in Ruth is the providence of God. There are various points in the story where the author will say things like, as chance would have it, Ruth ended up of all the fields she could have gone to glean in, she ends up in the one that's owned by Boaz, her future husband. As chance would have it, Boaz goes to the city gate in Jerusalem to look for this man who has a prior right to marry Ruth, and what do you know, he shows up, and what do you know, he's not interested. If we look back in our own lives, we can probably all think of many moments where certain things that happened that seemed coincidental were really acts of God's providence, connecting us with particular people, being in the right place at the right time to have something happen that would dramatically impact the future of our lives. That's what happens in the book of Ruth. We can see in this book how God watches over his children, how his providence guides the events of daily life in a way that produces unimaginable graces and blessings. Ruth reminds us that God is present in all the events and circumstances of our daily lives. Even the smallest events take on profound importance if, like Ruth, we stay true to the Lord and seek to be open to his will and his guidance. Another lesson that emerges is the lesson that Ruth herself presents. As I mentioned earlier, Ruth is a human model of God's chesed, his steadfast, faithful love. We are called to model that faithful love in our interactions with others, even when they do not reciprocate. Finally, in light of the New Testament, we can see that God gave Ruth a key role in salvation history. Had she not been faithful to her mother-in-law, had she not accompanied her to Bethlehem, had she not met Boaz and married him and had a child, there might have been no King David. There might have been no royal bloodline from which Jesus ultimately would emerge. Ruth has the honor of having her name preserved in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. One final note, Naomi is an interesting character. She is in need of redemption. The word redeem and redeemer appears a lot in the book of Ruth. The Hebrew word is goel, and in ancient Israel, a redeemer was not a savior who saves us from sin, as we understand Christ our Lord to be, but a redeemer was a family member who would step in and get someone else out of financial trouble, or in the case of Ruth, marry someone who needed to be cared for and to propagate her bloodline. Naomi needed a redeemer in that sense. She needed someone to help her out of her dire financial and family difficulties. But even more so, she needed to be spiritually redeemed. She was very bitter, not only towards her life circumstances, but towards God, whom she blamed for allowing these things to happen to her. And she receives that redemption through Ruth, her daughter-in-law. This was not a reward given to her because of her exemplary behavior. If we look at her behavior, in fact, she's angry at God, she's indifferent towards her daughter-in-law Ruth, and yet she is the recipient of unmerited love. Her redemption is due to someone else's faithfulness and not her own. And so it is with us before God. We are saved not because of our own merit or faithfulness, but by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Finally, I'll end with this. The book of Ruth is a book of the Bible that has a lot of appeal for women, but it also has an important lesson for men, a lesson about the transformative effect that a good woman can have on a man's life. Boaz serves as a reminder of just what can happen when a man marries a really good woman. Why? Because prior to meeting and marrying his future spouse, Boaz was totally ruthless. And on that terrible note, I conclude. Thank you.